And then all the awkward
Me.
Question?
No, I'm filming.
Huh?
I thought you said who's filming.
Do you want to film?
I got it.
All right, let's do this.
All right.
All right. My turn. So this chapter is about all the evidence we have that evolution occurs.
Wait, what?
Chapter 26. Evolution means changing over time. Sam, are you with me?
Yes.
Let's pay attention this semester.
Ooh, dang.
Shot. One way that we know that evolution occurs is through the fossil record. Fossils are remnants of previous life. If you find a bone in the ground, that shows that there was a living thing there before. That's a fossil. And let me tell you something. If bones stay in the ground for a long period of time, they turn to stone. Did you know that?
For real?
Bones can be replaced molecule by molecule with nutrients and atoms from the dirt and rock that surround the bones, and it changes the bones into stone, and so they last almost forever. And so you can find old bones, old shells, old body parts from animals and plants and bacteria even that are preserved as stone in the rocks and in the dirt. It's really cool. We call them fossils. And the fossil record shows what was alive a long time ago versus what is alive now. You know what that organism's called right there?
Horseshoe crab?
It's a trilobite. You ever heard of trilobites?
Oh, yes, sir.
Trilobites are extinct, but we know they used to live because there's fossils of them all over the place. I'll show you. I have the fossil collection. I'll show you.
Ooh.
It's very cool.
Did you find them? Or did
Nah, I ordered them. But anyway, it's neat. They're not. People sometimes think fossils are rare. Some fossils are rare, but some fossils are easy to find. They're very common.
Sure.
Shark's teeth. Those are fossils. Those are teeth that are left from sharks. Some of them are millions of years old.
Found a giant megalodon.
Yeah, megalodons went extinct millions of years ago. This is a machine that does what's called carbon dating.
Ooh.
Radioactive dating of fossils. We can tell from the radiation that comes out of the fossils how old they are. And they can tell this very precisely.
How did they figure that out?
There's a whole science behind it, and it takes a while to explain. But basically, all radioactive elements have what's called a half-life. And they change to another form over time. So you can tell by how much radioactive element is left how old the fossil is. If a bone is very old, it'll almost have no radioactive elements left in it. But if a bone is very young, it'll have a lot of radioactive elements.
Okay.
So you can kind of figure out the age from the amount of radiation coming out. And it takes expensive equipment to do it, but you can date fossils very accurately. And so scientists have made this what's called fossil record of everything they found. They've dated it radioactively, and they've figured out what the organisms were like. And we know a lot about what used to live on the Earth this way. Fossils are usually found in a type of rock called sedimentary rock. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, sir.
Sedimentary rock forms like this. Rivers bring sand and silt into the oceans. And the sand piles up over time. And so if you're a dead fish, you float down to the bottom of the ocean, and you're sitting there, and sand gets piled over you. Over and over and over. And just layer by layer, just a thin layer of sand every year builds up over time and forms thick sand, and the dead fish is buried down here. And the soft parts will decompose, but the bones remain. And just like I said, the bones will turn to stone over enough time. And over time, very often, the oceans will recede and go back, and you'll be left with layers and layers and layers of sedimentary rock, because the dirt, the sand, forms into rock over time, and there are all sorts of fossils in the sedimentary rock. Yeah.
So the sedimentary rocks form before the ocean recedes.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. They form in the ocean, and sometimes the ocean will recede. Sometimes the ocean recedes, or sometimes the land is pushed upward. Either way will cause the sedimentary rock to come up onto land. That's a trilobite fossil. Isn't that cool? Millions of years old. Hundreds of millions of years old. Look at those mammoth tusks. Mammoths are huge elephant-like creatures that are all extinct now. But they lived thousands or millions of years ago.
Do you think they're still thawing out that giant mammoth that was frozen?
Yeah, they found a baby mammoth frozen in the ice. And they thawed it out of the ice, and you could smell it. It was so fresh. And they took DNA from it and examined the DNA, and the Japanese scientists are trying to clone the thing by taking the nucleus from one of the cells and putting it in an elephant egg, and then putting that inside a mother elephant, and maybe she'll give birth to a mammoth. Ooh. And maybe we'll have mammoths in zoos in a few decades. Wouldn't that be cool?
Wouldn't want to be the zookeeper.
Yeah, it might be hard.
It'd
The
be
mammoths
cold.
are big. Yeah. This is an ichthyosaur fossil, a fossilized kind of like a dinosaur that swims in the ocean. It's a placoderm, an ancient armored fish, and we find fossil plants like these fossil ferns. There's all sorts of fossils out there. These are ammonites. They're long extinct, but they're related to snails. Don't they kind of look like snails? There's an old dinosaur footprint. We find all kinds of fossils. There's a kid standing in a dinosaur footprint. If he was there 70 million years ago, he'd have got stepped on. There's a scorpion in amber. Amber is tree sap. And the tree sap can wash over an insect and will harden, and the insect will be captured there inside the sap. Perfectly preserved. Did you see Jurassic Park? That's how the scientists got the dinosaur DNA. They went inside amber and they pulled blood from mosquitoes that were in the amber, and they got DNA from the mosquito's blood because the mosquito had been sucking on a dinosaur. And then they made dinosaurs out of that DNA somehow. It's science fiction, but it might could happen one day. Jurassic Park, big movie.
Can you do that with humans?
You could preserve a human in amber. I don't think it's ever been done. But it'd be a tough way to go in tree-sap.
I'll do it.
Hey, this is petrified wood. You ever heard of that?
I have some.
It's wood that is turned to stone.
Do you have any?
Underground. And then the ground erodes away, and the old tree is there, but it's now stone. It's not tree anymore.
I thought it was rock when I first got it.
Yeah, that's what it feels like rock. It used to be a tree, and then it changed to stone over millions of years.
Miss Rivers gave it to me.
Yeah, that's cool stuff. And again, the older fossils are further down in the layers. The newer fossils are closer to the top. That's the way it works. That's me.
What?
In the painted desert in Arizona.
Whoa.
And I'm checking out the layers of sedimentary rock. You see the layers?
Yeah.
This used to be the bottom of an ocean.
No way.
Where was it?
In Arizona. There used to be a big ocean in the middle of the United States, and the United States rose up, and the ocean waters all ran off.
Whoa.
And we're left with a bunch of sedimentary rock out there, and there's a whole bunch of fossils in it. It's a good place to go fossil hunt.
Did you find some?
I don't remember. I was only 8 years old then.
Oh.
Wasn't that cool? I had a good tan back then. We know from the fossil record that horses haven't always looked like they do now. They've changed over time.
How do they know
60 million years ago, horses looked like that. Because when they find horse fossils, 60 million years old, they don't look like modern day horses.
So how do they know that it was a horse?
Oh, it still had hooves, and it still had all the things that a horse has, but it was much smaller and shaped a little differently. Isn't that cool? A Heracotherium, they called it. They weren't much bigger than a dog. Wouldn't it be cool to have a little dog horse? Play with them? They would run around.
Kind of strange.
Elephants haven't always looked like they do now. This is what they looked like millions of years ago. And some of them went extinct. Whales and dolphins haven't always looked like they do now. This is what they looked like millions of years ago. They walked around on land.
What?
Nuh-uh.
Heck yeah. The further you go back in time, the less dolphin-like these things look.
I like the one that looks like a whale with legs.
Yeah.
It's like an alligator mixed with a whale.
And there's evidence. If you look at a whale skeleton now, there's evidence that it used to run around on land. You know what that evidence is?
Like some bone nubs.
Leg bones.
Leg.
A whale has leg bones embedded in its tail, and they don't do anything. They're just little tiny nubs, what's left of the legs. They're called vestigial structures. Can you say vestigial structures?
Vestigial structures. Is that like in a snake?
Vestigial structures are structures that are still there, but are real small because they're kind of caught in the act of disappearing. Our tailbone is a vestigial structure. It's evidence that we came from creatures that had tails. Have you ever heard of the appendix?
Yes, sir.
You have a little flap of tissue hanging off your intestine. It's called the appendix. It's actually pointing to the wrong thing. That's the appendix there. And that's all that's left of a giant organ that our ancestors had that broke down plant material. Our ancestors, 50 million years ago, could eat leaves. You go try to eat leaves now.
Why don't we all
You'll just have bad diarrhea. You can't eat leaves very easily. We don't have the digestive system to break it down because the human ancestry line moved to a diet of fruit and meat. We didn't need as many leaves, so we didn't need this big organ for breaking down leaves. Isn't that interesting? We call that a vestigial organ, the appendix.
Is that like the leg bones in snakes too?
Yeah, snakes have little leg bones. Snakes came from things that had legs. Lizards.
Like salamanders?
They kind of upgraded.
Well, salamanders an amphibian. So the amphibians evolved
Salamanders.
into reptiles like lizards, and the snakes came from the lizards. But if you go back far enough, yes. All living things are related if you go back far enough.
Wait, what is the definition of the best?
A vestigial structure is a structure that's really small and doesn't seem to be of any use because it is what's left of an organ that was present in an ancestor. Like the appendix or the tailbone or the little legs in fish, in whales and snakes. Did you know some people are born with tails?
What?
See that guy? He got a tail. How about this kid? Born with a tail. Yeah, all it takes is one little mutation.
Wait, what do they do?
See,
with it?
you have your tail gene turned off.
No way. What?
You have a gene in your DNA that if it's turned on, you'll grow a tail. But it's turned off in all of it. But in some people, 1 in a million, that gene gets turned on and they grow a tail.
Wait, that's like a lot of people then. Like,
Well, it's actually less than 1 in a million.
that's a lot more people then.
Maybe 1 in 100 million or 1 in a billion. But a few people are born every year that have this mutation, and normally you just cut the tail off.
I hope they cut that off. I hope they cut
Does
that
the
off.
tail grow as they grow? It's like
I don't think so. I think it's...
Do that.
Hey, you know what that is? That's a cave fish.
Oh, do they light up?
They have a little eye spot. Let me turn on the light so you can see it. They have an eye spot but no eyes. They don't have any eyes because they live in caves where there's no light. And if you're born with eyes, they can't do anything, they can't help you see, and they can get infected. So you're better off if you don't have any eyes. So evolution favored the development of fish without eyes that live in these caves.
Well,
They
why
find
would
their way around by smell and feel. But they still have a little spot there. A little dark spot. That's a vestigial eye.
So it's not an organ, so to speak.
It's a non-working spot. It's what's left of an eye. We call it a vestigial structure. Isn't that neat? You need to also know about homologous structures. Homologous structures are structures that are similar amongst a lot of different organisms. Here's a great example. Humans, a human arm, a dog leg, a bird wing, and a whale flipper.
This looks like a hand.
They all have the same bone structure. They all have one bone on top, it's called the humerus. Two bones in the middle, they're called the radius and the ulna. A bunch of little pebble-like bones, they're called the carpals. And then a bunch of longer bones, they're the fingers or toes. And the same bone structure is seen in all these organisms. Yet one's for grabbing stuff, one's for running, one's for flying, and one's for swimming. They are all for different purposes, so why would they have the same bone structure?
Common ancestor.
They have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor, we figured out, is a reptile. And there was a reptile that had this bone structure, and some of those reptiles evolved to swim, and some of those reptiles evolved to fly, and some of those reptiles evolved to run, and some of those reptiles evolved to stand over a long enough time and have their arms free. So this is evidence of evolution, that all these organisms share a common ancestor. We call them homologous structures. Can you say homologous structures?
Homologous structures.
That's a great example of homologous structure. Embryological evidence. Excuse me. Look at this. All these different organisms. Humans, rabbits, cows, hogs, chickens, turtles, salamanders, fish. They all look the same as embryos.
Don't we though?
Check this out. A human embryo has a long tail and gill slits. Why would a human embryo have a tail and gill slits?
Common ancestor.
It's suggestive that we came from something that had tails and gill slits. We might have only been distantly related to them, maybe millions of years ago, but we still retain some of their qualities. The tail disappears as the human forms. The gill slits disappear as the human forms. So why would they be there anyway? They're there because if you go far back enough in human ancestry, you go through, you get all the way to fish. You see some fish changed and evolved into amphibians. And some amphibians changed and evolved into reptiles. And some reptiles changed and evolved into mammals. And some mammals changed and evolved into primates. And we're primates. We're going to go over the whole story from start to finish as we do these next several chapters. But it's very interesting. All animals are related to fish that lived in the oceans 500 million years ago. Isn't that neat? We all had tails. This is what we look like. Weren't we cute?
I'm so old.
Look at the tail.
Oh my god.
Little hands.
That's disgusting.
Oh yeah.
Now the last part of the reading talks about all the genetic evidence. Probably the most convincing evidence is the genetic evidence. If you examine the amino acid sequences of the proteins in different organisms, you can see similarities. And organisms that have very similar amino acid sequences are more closely related. Organisms that have very different amino acid sequences in their proteins are further apart from one another. And we can construct evolutionary trees based on all this genetic evidence. This is an evolutionary tree of frogs that was constructed from genetic evidence and shows which frogs are more closely related to one another and which frogs are further apart. These evolutionary trees can tell us a lot about how organisms evolve and change. Here is an evolutionary tree made from what's called molecular clock data. What they do is they take the DNA of one organism and compare it to the DNA of another organism and see how many of the A's and T's and C's and G's are different. Did you know humans and chimpanzees share 98, 99% of their DNA? Just exactly the same. But humans and dogs only share like 90%. It's suggestive that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees than they are dogs. And that makes sense, because we look a lot more like chimpanzees than we do dogs. And so you can construct evolutionary trees based on the similarities in the DNA. And you can come up with mathematical comparisons that can tell you exactly how closely related organisms are. And the more closely related they are, the more recently they diverge from one another. Yeah, good word. That was the word I was looking for. So that these two types of rickettsia diverged very recently because they're very similar. And these two types, maybe this one and that one, diverged a long time ago from one another. So what we're going to be doing in future chapters is studying these evolutionary trees in more detail. But you need to have some idea of how they're made, and they're often made by genetic analysis.